Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. To accomplish that goal I suggest gear that allows for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through trades, food and skill changes only. Today's class of choice is the Mesmer and the elite spec is the Virtuoso. We're going to talk about two different builds, an open world roaming build with 2 iterations and a power DPS build. As a starting point as usual, let's talk some pros and cons. The build has good sustained damage and burst capabilities with a quite easy rotation. Another advantage is that this build is fully ranged. It also provides the usual Mesmer utility kit with portals and stealth. A downside is that it doesn't have much utility in terms of boons and CC output. It's also quite squishy in full DPS gear, but you can make trade choices that can help with that. Before going into the details of the skills and such, let's look at the general playstyle of Virtuoso. It's basically the light version of a Mesmer in that it does not require you to micromanage clones. Instead, you will stock up blades that you can fire at your enemies using the blade songs, the 4 abilities above your weapon skill bar. These blades stay and get stocked out of combat as well and do not get removed when changing targets like clones do on Mirage and Chronomancer. This is great, particularly for open world roaming since you don't have to resummon clones all the time. The whole elite specialization centers around fast blade generation and timing your blade songs right. The phantasms that you cast are turned into blades instead of clones. You also gain access to blade skills and psionic type skills. All 3 dagger skills, all blade songs and all Virtuoso utilities but 1 count as blades. They also give a hint in the tooltip indicating so. Blade songs further count as shatter skills for everything that applies to or synergizes with shatters, so keep that in mind for when we talk about traits and specializations later on. In general, it feels great to play, both mechanically and visually. You are fully ranged, blasting mobs with your blades fluidly. While it is a great quality of life improvement for Mesmers, not having clones has a downside. They are not there as decoys, so you get the full aggro always when you're alone. This can be challenging in solo gameplay when you encounter enemies that cannot be kited by ranging it easily. For those, you might want to pack in additional defense, but more on that later. Alright, let's dive into the build, starting with the weapon choices. We'll be using dagger as the main hand weapon always. The benchmark for Power Virtuoso uses a greatsword on the offhand, but having dagger on the main hand at all times simplifies the rotation noticeably at the cost of around 10% DPS. It also makes the rotation very similar to the Condi DPS rotation, so you don't have to get used to different skills when swapping between Power and Condi DPS on Virtuoso. On the 2 offhands we're using Sword and Focus for the 2 Phantasm skills they provide for big damage. Let's start going into the Blade Song skills. Blade Song Harmony is the bread and butter Blade Song. Use this on cooldown, it's one of the hardest hitting abilities with 5 blades stocked. Using Blade Songs also increase your damage by 5% for 5 seconds through the trait Deadly Blades, so using them to maintain that buff is beneficial to all you do. The second one is Blade Song Sorrow. While this does less strike damage and is a condition-centric Blade Song, it still does respectable damage and also triggers Deadly Blades, so use it whenever it is available and you see Deadly Blades running out. Next up we have Blade Song Dissonance, which causes a daze for every blade you have. I usually save this for CC phases to provide a good amount. When you know you won't need CC, also use this to maintain Deadly Blades. Last Blade Song Requiem is only a last resort kind of skill, since it makes you block attacks for a good amount of times. So when you brought yourself into dangerous waters, Twin Lagos send their greetings, use this to safely escape. Moving on to dagger skills, the auto attack Flying Cutter is pretty basic. It's a blade projectile with 1200 range that also causes another set of blades after every 3rd cast of it, as long as the casts are within 5 seconds of the last one. This is also another advantage of using dagger at all times, because you don't have to worry about missing casts of the cutter bursts. Blade Call is a short cooldown fan of 3 daggers that go in a conal shape. This is one reason why being at range is a small DPS loss, because it is harder to hit with all 3 blades from this ability. While it seems basic, it is the ability that usually appears as the largest contributor to your damage due to the short cooldown and high damage it has. Unstable Blade Storm is a slowly moving AoE that regularly shoots blades to nearby enemies. It's a great AoE damage tool, but not the greatest tool for single target. It is still worth casting this on cooldown because any hit you do applies bleeding and stacks up blades. For both Sword and Focus, only the respective skill number 5 is used for damage. These 2 form, together with Phantasmal Disenchanter, the 3 phantasms you can create. They apply bleeding on critical hits, the Swordsman increases your ferocity when it hits enemies, they stock a blade when they disappear and apply Might and Vulnerability. They are the top priorities for your rotations and the reason why we swap back and forth between Focus and Sword. Focus does AoE damage, so that's the top priority for cleave damage, while Sword is single target only. Even though sword attack seems like it has a very short range, the Phantasm gets created whenever the enemy is within 1200 range. So you can cast this when at range as well, add a small DPS loss and losing the 8 stacks of might compared to being in melee. Sword 4, Illusionary Riposte, is a block skill that creates an illusion when you block an attack. This skill is good for two things. First off, of course, blocking an attack, and second, you can double cast this to shoot the bolt early, applying CC. The final weapon skill is Focus 4, Temporal Curtain. This is a pull skill which can be very handy in lots of situations where ads need to be close to a boss or on trash fights. This can, however, also be detrimental when ads should not be close to a boss. It's always good for the swiftness and some CC it provides though. Moving on to utilities. In the healing slot I always run Signet of the Aether. The great thing on Virtuoso is that it heals you for every blade you stock, and with 100% crit chance, you stock blades up very quickly. It's not only good for the passive healing though, because it also fully recharges all your Phantasm skills when you activate it. That's why it's part of the damaging rotation. It allows you to cast more Phantasms, meaning more damage. After that I usually run Phantasmal Disenchanter and Rain of Swords. Disenchanter is a Phantasm skill that does high damage, and Rain of Swords is very potent in AoE damage. Rain of Swords increases the cleave damage of the build by a noticeable margin and further contributes to blade generation. Next up, the default skill is Mantra of Pain. This has a very short cooldown and does great damage without a cast time, so it can be used while casting other skills. Finally, the elite skill is always 1000 Cuts. This skill does strong damage and further generates blades. Just be careful to not activate this when enemies are moving a lot, since you'll likely miss, since this is a quite narrow AoE skill that does not move after it's placed. While all the skills are very good, something that the default skill loadout misses is good CC options, particularly for open world. Therefore, I'll also list some options that you can go for to be able to provide strong CC. The first option would be Mantra of Distraction, which is a short cooldown days without a cast time. Second, you can use Sword of Decimation, since this immobilizes for 4 seconds. This is better on Condi builds since they have longer Condi duration, but still 200 Defiance bar damage by default, so pretty good, and is also a blade skill. You could also technically run Signet of Humility for the elite, which does the highest Defiance bar damage of a single hit in the game, but has a very long cooldown. So this should only be taken if you can't get along with the other skills. Let's continue with gear and consumables. As always on power builds, we'll be running mainly Berserker gear. Only the amulet is Assassins because you need that to reach 60% crit chance with Ascended gear. If you only have exotic gear, then you need additional crit chance up to the point where you reach 60% without Fury, so that Fury gets you to 100%. The rule on the armor is Scholar, which is also the standard for group content. Don't worry if you can't keep up the 6-piece bones up all the time in open world, it's not a big deal. There's no need to change to more defensive gear usually, because you can obtain all the necessary survivability by swapping trait choices or food. The sigils on the weapons are Force and Accuracy. You need the Accuracy sigil to reach 100% crit chance. The food is the standard power and ferocity food, and the utility item is the potent superior sharpening stone or any equivalent to it. If you want a bit more might in open world, you can buy the fried golden dumpling, since it gives you some concentration and might on critical hits without an internal cooldown. This puts you to quite a few might stacks in open world very quickly, so it can be better than the standard food at a very low price. If you can afford it, you can also run a writ of Masterful Strength to gain a little power boost over the sharpening stone. Alright, traits and specializations. The default specializations for group content are Dueling and Domination, because they provide by far the highest damage, given that you have other people providing boons. Dueling is the bread and butter for Power Virtuoso, because it centers around Fury, Phantasm boosts and higher critical damage. It'll also make your Phantasms apply bleeding on critical hits and grants them Fury, which is pretty essential for having them critically strike to apply bleeding. The bleeding on critical hits is also important because in this iteration of Power Virtuoso we rely on bleeding to stack up blades fast. Domination is the second specialization for group content, and it's just flat out increases your strike damage by a large amount. You apply more vulnerability, your Phantasms deal higher strike damage, deal higher damage against foes at lower health percent than you, and you deal higher damage against boonless foes. Since enemies rarely generate any boons, the Grandmaster trait is pretty much always active. In open world we'll be running Illusions instead of Domination. The reason is that Illusions reduces the cooldowns of Shatter skills, grants you higher damage whenever you stock up a blade, and it also grants you all the boons that your Phantasms have. Since your Phantasms have long-lasting Fury from dueling, this is a good way to provide yourself with permanent Fury, some quickness as well as a bit of additional might. In case you want a more laid-back experience, Inspiration is another good choice for very high consistent self-healing in open world. This makes encounters much easier to handle because pretty much all you do heals you. Shatters heal you in cleanse conditions, stacking a blade heals you for close to 700 and allies around you for 314, using mantras heals you for another 1000. This costs you some damage, but it can be very well worth it on harder encounters when you don't know the mechanics of the fight or whenever kiting damage does not work very well. Finally, we have Virtuoso as the lead specialization. With these trait choices, you apply bleeding on critical hits and stock up blades for every few stacks of bleeding you apply. This is another reason why having 100% crit is essential on every Virtuoso build. You also deal 5% more damage for a short time after using a Shatter skill, have Phantasms launch another blade skill and granting you Fury after expiring. It also makes Fury apply 15% more crit chance and converts 10% of your vitality into ferocity, which usually equals 100 ferocity. The benchmark build uses mental focus instead of jagged mind, but that reduces your blade generation noticeably, resulting in a more strict rotation since only your phantasms apply bleeding and thus stock up blades. Jagged mind is just much more convenient and it's not really a DPS loss in this build anyway. Before we go into the rotation, let's talk about support capabilities. Virtuoso does not have the classic alacrity or quickness build variants, but it does have the standard Mesmer utility kit. Mainly, you can use portals to teleport the entire group to a different location very quickly. Paired with Mimic and Blink, you can speed up many different encounters, like Spirit Run in Wing 1, several Fractal encounters or Twin Lagos with the portal strategy. Generally, Mesmers are the masters of skipping parts of group content for this reason. It of course takes a bit of practice to get used to it, but it's very convenient for everyone once you get it done. Basically, what you're doing is you simply put down the portal entry in a particular place, go to wherever you want to teleport your group, and then use the portal skill again. Note that the exit portal only lasts for 10 seconds, so only place it when the group is ready to use it. If you want to have access to a second portal, cast Mimic before you cast the first portal. Mimic will then be another portal skill after you cast the exit portal with a longer cooldown after it was used. You can also provide stealth to your group with mass invisibility and veil, and provide stability with Mentor of Concentration. Focus 4 also applies long-lasting swiftness to allies crossing it, so that's another way you can make things faster. In the final part of the video, let's talk about the damaging rotation. First off, make sure to not apply fear to the golem, because otherwise your benchmark will be skewed upwards due to superiority complex being active permanently above 50%, which isn't realistic in many fights. I suggest two different kinds of rotations that differ in the degree of complexity within. The beginner rotation does not involve casting Signet of the Aether to reset your phantasms, costing you like 1.5k DPS, so you can still get to close to 33k DPS with that one with fully min-maxed gear. The general idea of the rotation evolves around your phantasm skills, Sword 5 and Focus 5. In every cycle of the rotation you want to cast Sword 5 2 times, so you're delaying the swap to Focus until you cast the second Sword 5. This is done to maintain a good amount of Fence's finesse stacks after swapping off to Focus. Then on Focus, use Focus 5 once. Cast Dagger 2 and 3, all utility skills, and Shatters 1 to 3 on cooldown. Ideally you'd spread out your Shatters 2 and 3 so that you maintain deadly blades as much as possible. If you decide to use Signet of the Aether to reset your phantasms, prioritize resetting your Focus 5 because it does higher damage per cast. Note that it will also reset your Phantasmal Disenchanter, which is a neat side effect. The Aether Signet won't line up with your rotation since it has a 25-second cooldown, and the rotation loop is about 22 to 23 seconds. So you need to try and fit it into the focus section whenever it is available. If it doesn't fit into the focus section, simply cast it right after Sword 5 and Sword and cast 3 Sword 5s in that rotation. With this rotation you can get to around 10% below the current benchmark with a much simpler rotation. You don't have to worry about missing flying cutter bursts because you stay on dagger all the time, and you have more consistent blade generation by using jagged mind compared to mental focus. I'm pretty sure that better players than me could get out more from it than I do, so there's that. In fights where CC is required, save your Shatter 3 and use it with 5 blades to apply a good amount of CC damage. You can also use Sword and Focus 4 to apply additional CC damage. For Sword 4, simply double tap it to immediately send the counterblade. Focus 4 also has a secondary cast that pulls the enemies in, as I said before, applying a bit of CC as well. That is all you need to know for the simplified Power Virtuoso rotation. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Power Virtuoso. See you next time and happy blade stocking!